my goodness. At first I thought maybe our choir was going to start becoming a dance troupe, didn't you? That's pretty awesome. All things are possible to he who believes. Anyway, I just want to say I am so pumped about the Movies to Live By series that we are starting today. Oh my gosh. If you've ever seen a great movie, a movie that has moved you in your mind and in your heart, a movie that has changed your way of thinking, perhaps it's lifted up your understanding, perhaps it's opened your mind to new possibilities and transformed you so that you show up in your life in a different way. If you've ever watched a movie and had that experience, then you know what I mean when I talk about the movies that we are bringing forward in the Movies to Live By series this summer. And we're going to begin with a true gem. How many of you have seen Hidden Figures from last year? Oh my gosh. So, I always tell people that in our community, I've taught people Asian shame pose. It kind of looks like this. And what that means is, oh my gosh, I feel so terrible. I know I should have done that, or I know I shouldn't have done that. So those of you that did not raise your hand, I just want you to just practice that silent Asian shame pose. And just know that it's okay to have that feeling in here because you're held in love. But in any case, I think I was channeling my mother, okay? But, all right. So nonetheless, I wanted to talk to you today about the movie Hidden Figures that came out last year. It was indeed an amazing, amazing movie. It was filled with joy and with music. It was powerful. It was thoughtful. It was funny. But it was very thought-provoking. And it told the magnificent tale of 3 black women who were friends and co-workers. Down in Virginia, they worked for NASA at its national headquarters in the early 1960s. Now, this film comes from a book that is written by a black woman author. Her name is Margot Lee Shetterly, and she is very interesting because her father also worked at NASA, and he was a research scientist many years ago. And so she wrote this book that honors the hidden figures, the women who were essential to the success of the NASA space program back then. And so when I think about this movie, I think about the legacy that they bring to us. It's such a joy to watch them, for they moved past the challenges of the day, the racism, the sexism, the difficulties that they had just in struggling to go forward, to raise their families and to do the things that they needed to do. And through it all, each of them moved forward with their own individual gifts. They had talents and abilities far beyond anything that was supported in the general culture. And they rose beyond all of it to bring forward and see a hidden victory, a victory that triumphed not only their spirits, not only the NASA program, but it created a triumph in our country. And so today we're going to hold in honor that victory that they made and see it for ourselves as well.
They call it a mystery, but we're gonna call it victory. We'll be writing history. It's gonna be a victory. There'll be signs on top of signs, just so you know. History, it's saying a victory is with me. Oh, let them laugh about it. What about us saying? Yes, it's an uphill battle. But guess who else is playing? The next time you're in action and the ghost is in the room, watch it walk through the masses. You know that we've been used. So let it be. And go let it be. No matter how deep. No matter how deep. Just so you know the history is saying a victory is with me.
Yay. Woo. Wow, that was really awesome. That was really awesome. So I wanted to go ahead and as we move into talking about this film, I wanted to set the context for you. So imagine if you will, that we are all living in the 1960s. It's the early 1960s. And let's say that we are living in Virginia, where NASA headquarters are. And this is, as you know, it's a time in the Deep South, and it's a time when the Jim Crow laws were in effect. And so it's a time when it was legal to segregate blacks and whites away from each other. And so what that meant is that it was enforced in cities all across different states that there was going to be supposedly a separate but equal, but it was never separate but equal. It was separate and less. Privileges, support, and all that you needed between blacks and whites. And so there were signs that were put up everywhere that let you know, according to your race, what hospital, what library, what restaurant, what public transportation, what any kind of facility, anything that you wanted to use. It was very clear. Even a water bubbler, as we say in Wisconsin, a drinking fountain, was labeled. And so anything that you used that was public was segregated. And so if you can imagine living in a time in a place like this, it is hard for me to wrap my mind around. I know that those kinds of attitudes and those kinds of practices existed, but I can't honestly imagine what it was like to walk down a street and see signs where a person of color was not accepted, could not sit. And if they sat in the far back. And they were treated with so much disrespect, intentional or unintentional. But this was the landscape of our country at the time of the early 1960s. And consequently, it was also the time when our people began to rise up. Civil rights, equal rights were now becoming the tone of the day. And so we saw that there were all kinds of groups that were rising up because there was held a consciousness that we all need to come together as one and cross those lines of color, of difference, so that all people could experience and know true respect. And so you can imagine that this was a tumultuous time for many, many people in the North as well as in the South. But there was one thing that really brought all Americans together, and it was the space program. Do you remember the space program of the early 60s? Oh my gosh, I see Ginny is having a flashback. Yes. So it was an incredible time, and our country was in this wild race, not only against Russia, but we wanted to get the first person up to orbit the Earth. And we, at that point, had only had an astronaut up in space for 15 minutes, and that was it. And so there was this drive to get an astronaut up in space and be the first ones to truly make it in space. And all people in this country held a vision, because getting someone in space was not only a scientific wonder, but beneath it and behind it, what it symbolized was the reality of possibility. That we could go beyond that which we can touch and grab, and we could literally reach for the stars. And so all people in this country joined together, and President John F. Kennedy was right there in the midst of us, encouraging us to hold a vision. And NASA was abuzz with this effort. And so I want to introduce to you the three protagonists, the three women of this story who were fundamental to the success of the NASA program. You will see in the yellow shirt on the left, that is Mary Jackson. And she had dreams to become an engineer at NASA. In the middle is Katherine Goebel Johnson, and she was a math genius, and because of her intellect and skills, she was placed in the midst of engineers to work out calculations and problem solve so that we could go forward with technology and advance ourselves. And then on the far right is Dorothy Vaughan. And she was somebody who was a supervisor, and she was in middle management, but she wasn't given the authority or the acknowledgement of the work she did with the women that she worked for. And she also had a very keen mind, and she forwarded and problem solved the new computers that came into NASA to bring forward the space program that we desired. And so it was these three women that came together as friends and co-workers that made a profound difference in our country's history. And I think that each of them is significant not only for their contributions that stand alone, but I think they are significant because of the time in which they were able to overcome the challenges in our country. And so in the movie, we see a lot of different depictions of how racism and sexism is pervasive. And so I remember seeing this little interaction with Mary, who wants to become the engineer, and she's talking with the coworker, a Jewish coworker, a male, who has been able to reach his dreams. And he says to her, "So, if you were a white man, do you think you'd still want to be an astronaut?" And she answers and she says, "I wouldn't have to want it. I'd already be one." Thought-provoking. And I love the things that Dorothy says on the far right, because she continually experiences put-downs by her boss, played by Kirsten Dunst, who always puts her in her place, whether she means anything by it or not. And in fact, at one point in the film, she says to her, "Despite what you might think, I really have nothing against you all." And she responds by saying, I know that's what you think." And then one of my favorite examples of how racism and sexism shows up happens when Catherine, in the middle, has an interaction with a National Guard who later actually becomes her husband. And it is absolutely hysterical. She meets him at a church picnic at the urging of her two friends because she really doesn't even want to meet him. And so when they start chatting, he says to her, "I'm really surprised that NASA allows women to do this complicated work that is so taxing." Mr. Johnson has made a mistake. And she says to him, "Oh, Mr. Johnson, I think you should stop talking." And he says, "Well, you know what? I don't mean any disrespect." But she says, "Well, I'll have you know, I was the first Negro female student at West Virginia University Graduate School. And on any given day, I analyzed the binomial level, air displacement, friction, and velocity. And then I compute over 10,000 calculations by cosine, square root, and lately, analytic geometry by hand." And there are 20 bright, highly capable Negro women in the West that are computing in this way, and we are proud to do our part for the country. So, NASA does let women do some things at NASA, Mr. Johnson. And it's not because we wear skirts. It's because we wear glasses. Have a good day. Whoa, right? So, she is standing in her power, and she is not going to be put down or diminished in any way. And so you get the feeling of the kinds of limitations that are prevalent during this time. And they're put on these women because they're women. They're put on these women because they're black. And to illustrate this even more, I want you to really get a sense of what it felt like for them. And so I want to show you this first clip. And in it, we will see Catherine, the one in the center, working with a group of men engineers that are not exactly crazy about the idea that she's with them. The only one who really sees her, the only one who truly values her, is the boss, the lead engineer, played by Kevin Costner. So take a look at this scene.
Summertime in Virginia was an oven. All the kids eating ice cream with their cousins. I was studying while you was playing the dozens. Don't act like you was there when you wasn't. Running from the man, running from the badge. Don't act like you was there when you wasn't. Running for our plans in the judge's hands. Don't act like you was there when you wasn't. I know they say call for you all. But in my mind, I already jumped. If I stand still, I cannot get far. They want the moon, I'm on Mars. Sometimes my mind dies deep when I'm running. Together we'll fly. Oh, but no more running.
Ruth,
Yes, Mr. Harrison.
Ruth, where's that girl with the numbers?
On a break.
We'll take breaks now?
Sometimes my mind dies deep when I'm running. I don't want no free ride. I'm just sick and tired of running. Together we fly. Oh, but no more running. No.
My God, where have you been? Are you finished yet?
Almost. He said by the end of the day.
The end of the day around here was yesterday.
I need those done first.
He wants those done first. Okay. Get going.
I'm sorry about that. Somebody's working on it right now.
Catherine has just run 6 blocks to go to the bathroom. She cannot use the bathroom in the building she's in because there is no sign for colored people to use the bathroom, so she has to run. And if you've ever had to go to the bathroom, imagine running for 6 blocks. And not only that, when she comes back and she has thirst as she's doing her work, she chooses to fill her coffee cup from the coffee canister, and all of the engineers around her are looking at her and they're looking at each other because she has the audacity, unintentionally, to fill her cup as though her thirst is the same as anyone else's. And so we see the power of this clip in how it plays out. And we recognize that racism was something that affected the very core of women and people in our culture at that time. And I want to tell you something, that the racism that we're talking about wasn't only in the South, and it wasn't only in the outside culture. It was also present in the unity movement. It was back a long time ago, actually, as far back perhaps as in the 1920s, there were study groups that were started by African American men and women regarding unity teachings. And Unity back in 1937 came out with a very bold statement. And in that statement, Unity said that all people without regard to race were equal in its teachings and in its practice. But those words reflected a very great intention. And like a lot of us, we think things, but there's sometimes a gap between our thinking and doing. Have you ever had that experience? Where you know something and you believe something, but when you put it into practice, it's like you've fallen asleep. Well, that's what happened in the unity movement. You see, that statement in 1937 was very profound, but it wasn't until 1952 when Unity had its first ordained black minister. And that minister was Reverend Dr. Johnny Coleman. Reverend and Dr. Coleman, she came to Unity Village in the early 1950s, and she came to study on the grounds. But here's the difference. When you were a student, you all lived on the grounds. You lived in the dorms on the grounds. But if you were a person of color, you could not stay. Unity provided buses to take you back to the city. And not only could you not stay like your fellow classmates, you could not use the Unity pool because you could not swim in those waters. And so day after day, Johnny Coleman practiced this for about a year. And she said this, she said, every day we read out of the daily word about love. And it tells us about how much we are called to love each other. But before the sun would go down every day, I had to get on the bus and be on my way back to Kansas City. This experience aided her, and it created a call for a higher consciousness. It was an interesting thing. She was unsettled by this practice, but because she so loved unity, she tolerated it for a long time. And so when I think about that, and I think about the power of love and what our co-founder Charles Fillmore says, he defines love as that unifying harmonic bond that brings all people together as one. It brings all things together without limitation. And so when I think about those words and how she knew them to be the truth, and how we knew that to be the truth in unity, and yet this practice went on, I appreciate that Dr. Coleman had the audacity to step up and to say that she wasn't going to participate in this way anymore. I love the teachings of the writer Charles Eisenstein, and as you know, we had a book series on the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. Well, Mr. Eisenstein is a great visionary. And one of the things that he says is that we are called to look at the ways that we hold other people in our minds if we are going to practice love. And he says that the way that we hold people has the power for them to be as we see them. So really hear that the way that we hold people in our heads, because we're always so smart and so right, but the way that we hold them gives people the power in our minds to be seen as we see them, because we don't know any better. We want to be right, and so we see them that way. He goes on to say, for example, if you hold someone as deplorable, then even their peace overtures will look suspect to you. And he says, but on the other hand, when you are able to see beyond conventional roles and categories, then you become able to invite people into previously unmanifested potential. He tells us that we cannot do this if we hold people in the ignorance of our own subjective reality of who they are and what they are. And in fact, he says, in order to break through that, in order to really live in love with one another, he says we've got to do something. We've got to ask a question that defines compassion. And we've got to ask, what is it like to be you? Not from my thinking, not from my understanding, not from my beliefs, but from you, from your heart and from your reality. What is it like to be you? And so when we hold this question in our heart, we see that it is essentially played out in the film. For we see that Kevin Costner's character sees Catherine for her genius and for her abilities, and he calls her up despite the lack of support from the male engineers and the women that are working in his team. And he honors her brilliance. And we see the same thing in another character in the movie. It's the astronaut, John Glenn. You see, he's going down the welcome line of all the women that are there to receive him. And all the white women are there first, and the women of color are at the end of the line. And he makes a point to not stop, but to continue on to greet some of the women of color. And at the end of the movie, when he is on his orbit, before he's on that orbit, he makes a point to say, I want to know that that woman, that smart woman, Catherine, has done these calculations, because if she is good with it, then I'm good with it. She had his life in her hands. And he had the ability to recognize her brilliance and honor her. Well, the same thing happened at Unity Village. The same thing happened. When Johnny Coleman said that she could not participate in the studies this way and she was going to quit her studies as a minister, her classmates rose up with her. They woke up and said, of course, it's wrong that she's treated this way. And so they petitioned the school to change its policy. In fact, they threatened to also quit if she wasn't given the same privileges that they had. And do you know what happened? The policy changed. It takes a rising up of consciousness to make a difference, combined with the power to act in love. So often we have consciousness, but do we have the willingness to stand in love? This is what we see in these women. We see that they have a growing consciousness that says, I know what my capacities are, I know what my abilities are. And out of love for myself, love and respect for myself, out of love and respect for this space program and for this country, I will stand for what is right and for what is good. And so there are different ways that the women encounter opportunities to stand up, but probably the most engaging one that we see comes with Mary, who wants to be an engineer, and she has now petitioned the court to give her the right to attend night classes, for she needs extra classes in order to complete her studies to become an engineer. So take a look at this clip.
Mary Jackson, petition to attend courses at Hampton High School.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Hampton High School is a white school, Mrs. Jackson.
Yes, Your Honor, I'm aware of that.
Virginia, still a segregated state, regardless of what the federal government says, regardless of what Supreme Court says, our law is the law.
Your Honor, if I may, I believe there are special circumstances to be considered.
What would warrant a colored woman attending a white school?
May I approach your bench, sir? Your Honor, you of all people should understand the importance of being first.
How's that, Mrs. Jackson?
Well, you were the first in your family to serve in the armed forces, U.S. Navy, the first to attend university, George Mason, and the first state judge to be recommissioned by 3 consecutive governors.
You've done some research.
Yes, sir.
What's the point?
The point is, Your Honor, no Negro woman in the state of Virginia has ever attended an all-white high school. It's unheard of.
Yeah, unheard of.
And before Alan Shepard sat on top of a rocket, no other American had ever touched space. And now he will forever be remembered as the U.S. Navy man from New Hampshire, the first to touch the stars. And I, sir, I plan on being an engineer at NASA. But I can't do that without taking them classes at that all-white high school. And I can't change the color of my skin. So I have no choice but to be the first, which I can't do without you, sir. Your Honor, out of all the cases you're gonna hear today, which one is gonna matter 100 years from now? Which one is gonna make you the first?
Only the night classes, Mrs. Jackson.
Wow. Oh. Yes. And so we can see the power of living our dreams and overcoming all that is before us. And I would say to you today, to know that all of us have obstacles in our lives. We all have limitations. Perhaps we have not had these, and not to minimize or diminish the power and the imprint of racism. But whatever the limitations are that you've had in your life, whatever the impact of limitations that you have felt, I invite you today to step to a higher vision, to raise your consciousness. I invite you to hold the dream that lives in your heart, to find a way to honor that dream. And know that as you do, like the women in this movie, Catherine, Mary, and Dorothy, all of us are given by the power and presence of God within us. We are given the ability to reach the dreams this 4th of July weekend, I invite you to take just a minute and listen to the dreams in your heart. Allow yourself to step away from and rise above any limitation imposed by others or by the thoughts in your own mind. And as you do, rise up like Catherine and Dorothy and Mary and bring forward a greater good, a good out of love for yourself and love for the good that it will be as a blessing to others. Do your best. Hold the vision and truly bring forward the power within you. It is your calling. It is your time. It is now. Thank you, and God bless.